Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, and this week your guest is actually also your host, i.e. I'm doing a solo episode once again. I got some really positive feedback from the episode before where I did I think it was 10 lessons from over 400 episodes, I believe at the time. We're now over 450 episodes, we're coming towards 500, and I'm not doing an episode on kind of lessons in that sense. I'm doing an episode on a topic that is to some extent in vogue. I don't think it will ever not be in vogue, but it's a topic that's close to my heart as a bodybuilder and someone who has been quote unquote ectomorphic and kind of one of those people that have struggled to hard gainer, let's put it that way. I've always been on the skinnier side and struggled to gain weight, gain muscle. And it's also something I go through all the time with clients. And I recently spoke about it very briefly on my Instagram, on my story, and got loads of feedback of people wanting me to talk on this topic more. And that is, you will have seen the title. I'm not sure what the title is at the moment, but it is going to be relating to mass gaining, bulking, being in a surplus, and troubleshooting that. Now, I am going to touch on some of the science, but that's not necessarily my bag. I really respect the researchers. Like, I get to interview people with PhDs, and they have their research labs, and this is their bread and butter. They break this down. If you ever want a breakdown of research, listening to those episodes is where you want to go, but also subscribing to something like the Mass Research Review, which is always linked in the description, by the way. We are a supporter of those guys and an affiliate in that sense. They do a fantastic job over there. I will be bringing up some literature, though, that I think is useful, and I will also be doing my best to reference every single one of those studies that I might talk about in the description, because I think that is important, especially on long form content. I have no idea how long this episode's going to go. I'm just going to do it as long as it needs to be, so bear with me. You might listen to this in chunks, but I'm going to be talking a lot about the practical side of gaining muscle and nutritionally being in a surplus, because I think that's where my value really comes in as a practitioner. Like, it's all good and well, like, we can all purchase the muscle and strength pyramids and see exactly what Eric Helms thinks we should be doing nutritionally on paper for building muscle. And we can have Eric on and talk to him, and he can give us all that great information, but it's putting it into practice that is often the challenging part. And so that's something I have a ton of experience in, considering I've now been trying to build muscle for like 20 years. Man, it makes me feel old. And also, obviously, now been in the industry and coaching people for a decade. And so I've had hundreds of clients who I've helped build muscle and go through purposeful building phases. So with that spiel out the way, we'll go through. I have notes, so if you ever see me kind of looking to the side here, actually, for those watching, I'm actually looking at you in the eye, because I can actually look at the camera, whereas normally when I'm doing a podcast, I'm looking at my screen at the other person, trying to gauge their body language, all of that. So yeah, you'll see me look to the side sometimes, because that's where I have my notes. Regardless, let's jump into it first of all. So there's still this debated topic, and this is why it's somewhat in vogue at the moment in terms of, is a surplus required for muscle growth? Now, for the longest time, and I believe I used to think this, that a surplus was required for muscle growth. And I think some people still think that a surplus is required for muscle growth, but we have lots of data to just suggest that is not the case. We don't have to have an excessive amount of calories coming in versus our expenditure to be able to gain muscle. And the best source of information I think that we have for that is a meta-analysis by Murphy et al., which explored the impact of calorie deficits on the magnitude of lean mass gains. And they did find, however, that energy deficits significantly impaired gains in lean mass when compared with studies with neutral or positive energy balance. So whilst we can build muscle in a deficit, it's harder than if we're at maintenance or a surplus. We gain less muscle in those, because building muscle is an energy intensive process, and a shortfall of energy is likely to limit muscle growth. You ever think about, when you're in a calorie deficit, is your training as good as it can be? No, you're not recovering as well. You don't adapt as quickly. So that has real implications, because, and I'll say this, I've probably said it so many times on the podcast as well, that training is the match that lights the fire for muscle gain. You could do whatever you want with nutrition. If your training is not in a place to create a stress response, to generate an adaptation for the body, to have to build muscle tissue to kind of deal with this stressor, then you aren't going to be building muscle. You have the most perfect protein intake, nutrient timing protocol, amazing sleep. You're not growing muscle. You need to give the body a reason to, and that's training. Nutrition is just permissive. So a maintenance or surplus of calories is superior to being in a calorie deficit. I believe, and I don't know the research off the top of my head, but I think it's calorie deficits of over 500 are making it even harder to grow muscle. But when we're in 500 calorie deficit or less, it seems like much, much more likely. So the larger calorie deficit you're in, the further you move away from maintenance or even a surplus, the harder it is to build muscle, basically. But it definitely can happen. We all know that. We've all seen people do it. It just is more likely for certain individuals versus others, which is going to be another thing that we'll talk about, just like the training being the match that lights the fire, that we have different things that lead to our overall muscle building potential. And that has real implications for how we might want to go about our nutritional intake, primarily calories, for that. So, what about the best? It's one question to say, is a surplus required for muscle growth? It's another question to ask, what's best for muscle growth? Is it maintenance or a surplus? And that's something that's been debated, and that is currently in, to some extent, debate. We have, I don't know, a Greg Doucette comes to mind of someone who talks about, I think he called them main gaining, or you might have heard of maintenance phases, this sort of thing, which is a bit strange because I'm like, if it's maintenance, it's maintenance. So you must be saying if it's main gaining, you're gaining, or if you're in gaintenance, then you are gaining. It's just a very like lean bulk. I guess it throws back to the lean bulk, right? And saying like you can lean gain. I don't think those individuals are necessarily suggesting that all you're gaining is muscle tissue, but you're trying to almost gain at the rate limiting amount of muscle gain potential. So say you can gain 1 pound of muscle in a month, you would only look to gain 1 pound of body weight, hoping that all, if not the vast majority of that, is muscle tissue. But that can have some problems, which we'll come to. But regardless, so what's best for growth, maintenance or a surplus? So we have got a few decent studies that have looked at this. So we have a study by Smith and colleagues. They use some sophisticated statistical modeling to find the optimal rate of weight gain. And their model suggested gaining about 0.55% of body mass per week was the ideal rate for lean gains, which is, I mean, a lot of you will hear that and be like, oh, that like 0.5% a week, basically. So 1% or so per month. That sounds like something I've heard before, which is cool. And there's a reason for that, right? And then a study that's been spoken about a ton, and really for a long time, it was the best evidence we had. And there aren't a lot of studies that have looked into this because in reality, who's putting money towards studying muscle gaining and being in the surplus is like there's many more important things to be researching, right? But this was a 2013 study by Garth et al. And that they found, basically, long story short, they found the sweet spot was closer to 0.2 to 0.3 gain. So about half what what Smith and colleagues were suggesting. So that's 0.5% per month versus closer to 1%. So pretty damn small to like really lean gain in that sense. Now, what I will say is with both these studies, it was resistance trained individuals, I believe they were looking at. But the length of study, I think the Garth one was actually 12 weeks long, maybe. And the Smith et al. Was closer to like 6 weeks. So not that long. And particularly with the Garth study, this is a criticism I always held for that one, was whilst they were doing some hypertrophy training, they're also elite athletes doing other sports. So when we think about the term MRV, max recoverable volume, when you're having a big chunk of your volume taken up by other sports that are non-specific towards muscle growth, you can imagine you're leaving quite a lot of gains potentially on the table if you removed that sport practice, and now you could suddenly recover from a lot more work. And so that always was like, I reckon they could have gained more muscle if they weren't doing these other things, right? You think about it for yourself, like if you were playing football multiple times a week or soccer, that's going to be taking away from your leg training for sure. Like there's implications for that. You have to be careful about how you do it, especially the more advanced, the more trained you are. You don't have as much capacity to put towards these things. Your muscle growth potential is less. So I think based off that data, we have a fairly decent understanding that a surplus isn't required for growth, but anything above maintenance is slightly better for muscle growth, but there's probably really significant trade-offs past a certain point, and not much above maintenance is required to kind of almost maximize the muscle growth response. And if we go much higher than that, we're starting to gain exponential amounts of body fat. But as we move away from a small surplus to maintenance, to a small calorie deficit, to a larger calorie deficit, we are making it less and less likely. We're making the process of muscle building, which is energy intensive, more challenging. I mean, even being in a surplus itself is anabolic. Like, it could be anabolic for the wrong reasons. It could obviously lead to lots of fat gain, but it's also anabolic. It puts us in a better environment for growth. The body is more willing to grow when there is a surplus there. And one of the things I always like to come back to, again, as a practitioner, and zooming out and not just, and thinking about as an evidence-based practitioner, again, it's not just research. What other things do we have available? We have a ton of evidence looking at bodybuilders. What have bodybuilders always traditionally done? They've always gone through gaining and cutting phases. And there is a reason for that. If it was as easy as just to maintain, that was quote unquote the optimal way to go about things, you'd think bodybuilders would have done it by now. Now, we don't have to do, I think it's Lee Priest is like the fat bulk. You don't have to go wild, but having that little bit of a surplus is very helpful. And also, when I think back to when I started bodybuilding, I was like 5'10", I'm still 5'10", and I started when I was a fully grown adult, 5'10", and I believe I weighed like 140 pounds. It's pretty damn freaking light. And I'm sat here pretty damn lean at 180 pounds. And I'd step on stage, shredded to the bone at, I don't know, less than 10% body fat, between 5 to 10% body fat at around 170 pounds. So it's like, man, could I have really got from 140 to 170 without having gained? Like, I struggle to think about that. So again, just kind of, does it pass the real world test of further evidence that we have? And I just can't think of many successful bodybuilders who haven't gone through purposeful gaining phases. And those who I see successfully continue to improve year after year are going through these phases. And it comes back to just a fundamental thought in life, that like nothing comes for free, and a degree of discomfort is required to kind of really see improvement in things. And for every gimme, there's a gotcha. It's a saying that I love. And like, the gotcha is that body fat accrual, but the gimme is you're gaining good amount of muscle compared to what you could if you're in a deficit or maintenance there. So now, how fast do we gain is the question. And obviously Garth and Smith gave us an idea of like 1% or less, maybe. But I do think it really comes down to your muscle gain potential. And I think Helms et al., so he recently, talking of Eric, his paper came out, which I have some notes down here on. And this is where they were assigning groups of pretty damn well-trained individuals. And actually, there was only 17 people. So you have to bear that in mind with research as well, which is why I always like to bring in anecdote or like further evidence too. The length of time of the studies has been pretty short, right? In this study, it was 17 trained individuals, only 2 women, by the way, and I believe the other ones were based off males, the other studies that I kind of spoke about. And they were looking at maintenance versus a 5% surplus versus a 15% surplus, I believe is what it was looking at, or between 5 to 15%, because ultimately, and this will come up at some point again, they ended up landing at, I think, what did they say? The surplus was pretty equivalent. So a prescribed 5% surplus could be too small to logistically kind of measure for most participants, especially over such a short time scale. I don't know what a 5% surplus would lead to in terms of rates of weight gain, but certainly this is why like a lot of people just ended up really struggling to try and just hit a 5% surplus, and why many of them were up to a closer surplus to one another. So that happened. But yeah, in terms of what they found there, and these individuals were only training full body 3 times a week. And that was interesting because the muscle that grew the most was the biceps. And the biceps were trained for a total of 18 sets, including indirect work from like pulling. And so they had the highest amount of volume trained through them. They grew the most, which makes sense. That aligns with kind of broader research, I think. And other areas didn't really grow that much. But what they really, really found, and the kind of big take home, was that there was exponential body fat gain the larger surplus you were in. And so they don't recommend large surpluses either. It kind of confirmed a lot of the previous research there. But bearing in mind, and this is why I brought it up, only really the biceps got like a really good dose of volume. Like people who take this seriously, like the majority of you listening, you'll be training 4 to 6 times a week and doing more volume than they were doing in this training study. So like they say here, it is possible that faster rates of body mass gain could enhance hypertrophy to some degree if sufficient training stimulus is provided, because training stimulus is a muscle gain potential. If you can only do 3 training sessions, then you can only do a certain amount of volume before it starts to become not useful towards muscle growth. But if you could do 6, now that potentially opens up double the volume, a more potent muscle growth stimulus. You are generating a better muscle growth potential, therefore. So they said, while further work is needed, if a sufficient training stimulus is provided, the rate of body mass gain that will be best to support hypertrophy is likely individual. Rates may be influenced by prior training experience. So are you a newbie or are you super advanced? Hereditary factors, which like, hey, genetic potential, that sort of thing. And then other variables like how's your sleep? How's your stress management? Maybe you've got a dog waking you up in the middle of the night, or a baby or a newborn. Are you trying to go for a promotion or are you not? How good's your nutrient timing? Have you got your protein in place? How's your food quality? That could have implications for your general well-being and health. How is your supplementation? Are you taking creatine? That's going to help build your muscle growth potential. Only a small amount, but hey, we need everything, especially as a natty, to help us there. And then how's your exercise selection? How's your programming? How's your fatigue management? Well, that's your sleep and stress, right? But there's all these things. How specific is your program towards muscle growth? And so that all builds into your kind of muscle gain potential. And they had kind of recommendations based off that. Like, hey, do you want to move more towards like 1 or 2% body weight gain? Some recommendations I like in general is based off your muscle gain potential. Now, again, I'm going to just expand upon this. You might think, hey, I'm a novice, and so my muscle gain potential is high. And yes, you have that in your favor. But if you are at school and you've got a job on the side and a girlfriend and whatever, like you're doing a side hustle, you've got all these other things that are pulling you away. You can only train once a week and you're getting 4 hours of sleep and you barely ever hit like 1 gram per pound of protein. Normally it's closer to half that. And like your nutritional quality is poor, you're often not feeling your best. Suddenly, what is a high growth potential, suddenly you're not in that position. So if you were to go into a surplus, you're now actually more likely to gain heaps of fat tissue. Whereas you could have someone intermediate who's nailing their sleep, nailing their nutrition, has a really great training program, good exercise selection technique, trains intensely, really pushes themselves. Did I say excellent sleep? They're doing everything right. They're crossing their T's, dotting their I's. That person, even though they're more well-trained, years under their belt maybe, they could have a higher muscle growth potential than you. So they might actually want to be in a higher calorie surplus than you. So basically you align your calorie surplus with your muscle growth potential. And so if you have a higher muscle growth potential, I think anywhere like 2 to 3% of additional body weight per month can be a great place to go. That's as fast as I ever really see. And there's not many individuals that should be as fast as that, in my opinion. And then medium is 1 to 2%. So if you're like an intermediate doing a lot of things right, that's probably a great place to be. And then 1% or less is for your, like me, trying to do everything I can to build muscle, but I've been training, like I said, for like 20 years. So the realistic thing is I don't have a huge muscle growth potential. And so I kind of go more towards that low end. But yeah, that's kind of where I view how fast to gain. And I much prefer thinking about percent of gain of body weight versus like calorie surplus size. I think it's just easier to track your body weight at least 4 times across the week. First thing in the morning, all good practices. Hopefully, you guys are doing this sort of thing 4 times a week, at least every day if possible. Take your weekly average, compare that to last week, compare that to last month, and like see trends over time. And you just try and land within these ranges. And don't get super precise or anal about hitting one or the other. If I'm slightly over 1% for a month, I'm not screaming and stressing, especially if in 1 week it looks like I'm trending that way. I was look back at previous data. And this might be some of the troubleshooting that we're going to come to be honest, later on. But now you've kind of got a good broad picture in terms of, okay, so for muscle building, a surplus is required to maximize muscle growth, but we don't need much of one. And the size of surplus should scale to your muscle growth potential. So that's kind of where we are there. And then more briefly, we'll go over sort of macros, just to kind of cover that. So in general, the recommendations are 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight per day. I personally have a bias for higher protein intakes. I just have seen good results that way, and I enjoy higher protein, and I find most people I end up working with are in a similar boat, bodybuilders or people that are like, yeah, interested in this space in particular. Probably most of you have a preference for higher protein. So I tend to not go like lower than 2.2, to be honest. So like 1 gram per pound, 2.2 per kilo. But there are people, and this is still to some extent up to debate, who are suggesting, for example, Milo Wolf has suggested up to 3 grams per kilo. And that's based off a more recent, I think it's the most recent, don't quote me on that, a meta-analysis where it said like the dose-response relationship between protein intake and muscle mass increase. And that was a systematic review and a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials where it actually showed kind of a similar relationship to volume and hypertrophy, as in we think there's a U-shaped curve. There's got to be, really, for volume and hypertrophy, where you get more and it diminishes, and then at some point you do so much that you get worse results. Probably the same happens to protein, where you have that, and probably because having more protein leads to taking away from fat and carbohydrates, and that's going to lead to you being unhealthy or not able to train as well, not meeting your essential fats, for example. And so, but again, it seems to be like they haven't seen a limit to like the benefit of protein. You just like have more protein, you seem to get more benefit. So yeah, some people are advising higher than 2.2 per kilo, up to 3 grams. And so I kind of see that, and that aligns a little bit with my bias. I'm like, hey, I'm about not doing the minimum, kind of similar to, hey, you can grow at maintenance, you can grow muscle at maintenance, but hey, I want to grow maximally and make sure I get every gain left on, like that I have available to me. So here I'm just like, hey, why would I go to the lower end of protein when there might be small benefits to having more? So long as it doesn't take away from my fat and carbohydrates, I'll kind of go there. Anyway, that's a tangent. Fat and carbs, way less important. The more I've been doing this thing, the more I realize you can't really outsmart the body. There was a while, some of you might be aware of, I was doing like a high carb mass. And this was kind of based off the fact that, hey, carbohydrates you get a release of insulin when you have that. Insulin is anti-catabolic, then arguably anabolic. And so fat isn't that way. Fat is more likely stored as fat. And so maybe having more carbs is a little bit more like you're more likely to lean gain in that sense. Carbs are what fuel performance and recovery, all of this, yah. But in reality, once you're having sufficient of both, which if you're in a surplus, you probably are, if you're not going below, say, 40 grams of fat, you're having at least like 2 grams per kilo of carbohydrates. I think it's very hard past those minimums to really notice too much difference either way. You can always experiment. But again, like I said, what I find to be best is we're gaining slow, we're gaining long. We need this to be sustainable and enjoyable. So if you can have some food freedom with you've got to have that protein intake, but if you can have some freedom with your carbs and fat, and it seemingly not really lead to worse results, as long as you're well above those minimums, why not do that? So I kind of have that approach. If I give ranges, I do often give ranges to clients, is because if I don't give a range, sometimes I find that their fats can get quite high, especially deeper into mass phases when your hunger isn't so high. And so you often opt for like high carb and fat foods, which are normally processed, highly palatable, not particularly health promoting, and that can just lead to poorer well-being, poorer digestion, and ultimately, yeah, not the best. I tend to find saturated fat get real high, potentially even trans fats start creeping up. Definitely don't want that, and we want the majority of our fats. The evidence seems to suggest unsaturated is the way to go versus lots of saturated fats. Not to say saturated is bad, you just don't want to have tons of that, and that's where I tend to see people going like high fat meats. Cheeses, again, like lots of chocolate, confectionery items. Whereas if I cap it and they have to have a good amount of, therefore, carbs, your fats tot up fairly quickly. So anyway, that's kind of where I go with fat, carbs, and protein there. In terms of composition, this is something we'll come onto later in terms of like in practice, one of the issues I find, but 80-20. The 80-20 rule is so good. 80% minimally processed, wholesome, excellent food. I kind of say minimally processed because I do think generally minimally processed foods are superior for health, but there are some quite processed foods like a whey protein that can be really, really health promoting and really useful, especially for like people interested in bodybuilding. But yeah, I think lots of plants, fruit, veg, lots of your kind of lean meats, eggs, nuts, seeds, these sort of things. That should be the base of your diet always. And then 20% is like more what have you, you know? You don't get extra gold stars once you like, in fact, if you have too much fruit and veg, your fiber could get to such a point that it's like you're causing gastric distress and it's now a problem for you. And this is a while since I've looked, but I do remember looking into kind of fruit and veg and where that 5 a day came from. It's a recommendation here in the UK at least. Recommended to have 5 fruit and veg a day. And I remember seeing, I think it was in some meta-analyses looking at fruit and veg intake and their impact on cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. And up to like 5, there was like almost exponential benefits in terms of like protecting against that. Past 5 towards 10, you still saw benefit, but it was starting to dwindle. And then 10 plus, it was like flatlining a bit. I don't know how many people are really having 10 plus fruit and veg though. At the moment, I'm actually at about 10 most days. And yeah, can actually do it quite simply, which is just one of those things. But anyway, I'm rambling. Where was I? So food composition, 80-20. 80-20 rule is just a great way to go. And that scales towards the less calories you're on. That means that 20% is really not that much. The more calories you're on, that 20% is larger, but you get that quantity, which can allow to make up for a lack of quality, but you're still having a lot of quality because it's 80%. So it scales. So I just think it's such a great way to go. And especially because bodybuilders can get really like pigeonholed into clean eating, like what's clean. And I always think of the example of pizza is one of my favorite foods. You tell someone I'm eating a meal that's it's some cheese, some sourdough bread, and I've got some tomato salad with, I don't know, whatever, some olive oil. And it's like, oh, that sounds like a really healthy meal. It's like, or you tell them we're eating a margherita pizza, sourdough, and they're like, oh, no, that's a demonized food all of a sudden because it's put together. Anyway, so, you know, it's just one of those things. It's a bit arbitrary. But I've just found the further I've got into this, the more longevity it breeds to have that kind of flexible approach to your nutrition. 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories is a really good rule of thumb too. That's the general recommendation that I've seen reported in terms of like research based. I don't have the reference for that, apologies, but 14 grams there or thereabouts is a great aim to go for, and that works out really nicely for a lot of people. And that ensures normally if you're getting that, then you're doing lots of whole grains, you're doing lots of plants. Then in terms of timing, I had a great podcast with John Tromlin. I say his name wrong every time. Don't shoot me for that. But his study was the no upper limit to anabolic response to protein ingestion, i.e. the more protein you eat, the more muscle protein synthetic response we get, and then the longer it lasts for. And so previously we thought there was maybe a muscle full effect. So we'd eat an amount of protein, and if you went over, and this is where the whole like, hey, more than, I don't know what it is, 30 grams of protein, and the rest of that's wasted. It's not wasted. It was just thought that maybe you hit a ceiling And so having more than that in one sitting maybe wasn't the best idea. But now it's like, hey, actually, we don't hit a ceiling, because it used to be thought you hit a ceiling and you're better off than letting it come down, so then you can fill it back up. So we like the amount of MPS under the curve, we can have that pulsar, like, 4 to 6 feedings of protein spread through the day with a minimum of 20 grams of protein to meet the leucine threshold, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, it just doesn't seem to be true. I love that what inspired John to do this was seeing snakes eat like a whole freaking rabbit and like surviving well off that, right? And the research based off them, like where they had this no limit to MPS in a sense. And this no limit, hey, they did 100 grams of protein, so we can't really say that more than that is going to see different results. But essentially, we no longer have to worry as much about nutrient timing in that sense, especially splitting up your protein to a large extent. However, there has been not much research, but there was some research looking at 2 versus 3 meals a day, spreading out your protein between 2 or 3, and 3 seemed to be superior overall. So I tend to have the recommendation of, hey, at least you want to meet your total protein by the end of the day. Most important, how you spread that, at least 3, roughly evenly spread. And like, it's really nice because it's, what is it, breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe a protein shake chucked in there if you want, and probably makes sense for your dinner, or if you are having any lengthy periods of time without having protein, to have a higher protein intake. So maybe with dinner, what I do is I have an Ninja Creamy and after my dinner, and that gets that meal to be pretty high in protein. So my MPS response is really quite high, and whilst I'm kind of fasting through the night, I have that elongated going through, kind of drip feeding my muscles. That's what they used to do to sell casein, and casein pudding is also a nice idea to have there. So anyway, that's kind of protein for you. That's my perspective on that in terms of nutrient timing. Then carbohydrates, in brief at least. Carbohydrates, I just have the philosophy of prioritizing these around the workout. I think that just makes sense for multiple reasons. It's not a huge deal because the timing of carbohydrates becomes way more important the more glycogen depleted you are. So when you're dieting, you're more likely to be glycogen depleted versus not dieting. If you're training first thing in the morning after a fast, more likely to be glycogen depleted. If you're doing a long workout with lots of volume, maybe it's legs, you're more likely to be glycogen depleted in those muscles. So maybe arguably becomes a little bit more important. Or if you're training the same muscle group like twice in one day, you split your push session into like, hey, in the morning I'm doing chest, in the evening triceps. Maybe it makes more sense to be more on top of your nutrient timing with carbohydrates there. There's also some aspects of chrononutrition that come into this, where it has been found that we're more insulin sensitive earlier in the morning. And so we're more insulin sensitive also around training. So generally eating more food around those times is likely going to lead to better nutrient partitioning. We also don't want to eat tons of food before bed. That tends to hurt people's sleep, especially like carbohydrates. Seems to like really heat the body up, and you need your core body temperature to come down, and you actually need to be quite cool throughout sleep, so it can disrupt it there. So really my kind of response with carbs is prioritize it around the workout. That's when they're probably going to be best used to support muscle glycogen potentially, and then also to have it partitioned the best way and support kind of chrononutritional aspects as well. In terms of like pre-workouts and that sort of thing, it is interesting to note that there is some research looking at pre-workouts and not being hungry versus hungry. And in fact, like being hungry pre-workout is something you definitely want to avoid. And I think we've all been there, where like if you are starting to feel hunger during a workout, it just doesn't help. So an intra-workout can actually help during those circumstances to kind of abate that. I also find intra-workouts, whether or not it's blood sugar, whether or not it's placebo, whether or not it's to do with like the dopamine from the flavoring, they tend to keep me quite switched on during a workout. So I do quite like an intra-workout here or there. But that's very context dependent, because arguably the time intra-workout is going to be most favorable during that glycogen depleted state is when you're dieting. And the deeper you're into a diet, the less likely you're going to want to spend calories on a liquid carbohydrate shake, basically. But so where am I going with this? So yeah, I can actually reference the study I did want to bring up. It was, I'm going to say that pronounce it wrong, but Udin et al. apologies, 2021 and 2020, they've looked at this twice. They found reduced hunger improves performance for low to moderate training volumes, like 6 to 10 sets. I would only think more, it would, like if you had more volume than that, it would still help and maybe be even more important. It seems to be especially important after an overnight fast. So they actually had water versus slop, quote unquote, and the carbohydrates were the same. So they had pre-workout carbs, but the slop provided a better ergogenic aid than the water, even though the carbs were the same, just because it had that psychological effect of being a bit more filling and kind of filling up the stomach, that sort of thing. So take that for what it is. Yes, I believe that's most of everything I probably want to say for carbohydrate timing. I don't think I need to worry. I kind of summarized it in terms of your glycogen state. So, for example, with the topping off of glycogen stores to help regulate blood sugar during sessions and things, because muscle glycogen takes, to fully get stored and assimilated, we know this from like peak weeks for bodybuilders. There's a reason Cliff Wilson does a rapid backload, and you have to be super careful. And that's a whole day that you're trying to maximize glycogen stores. But to top them off, you might need at least a couple of hours, and it needs to be something relatively easy to digest without lots of fat and fiber to help you for that workout. So you just have to bear in mind, if you eat something like immediately before your workout, it might be helping, but not for the reason that you necessarily think as such. Yes. So anyway, we can go to, in terms of fat nutrient timing, I don't think you need to really worry yourself too much about that. It's only if you are really concerned about speeding up digestion, because that's the main role that fat is going to have. It's going to slow things down. So you could argue, right, so pre-bed, you talked about wanting protein and MPS to be elevated higher and digested longer. Maybe some fats during that time could be a time to do it, or times you're not going to have protein for an extended time. And then again, pre-workout and close to your workout, you don't want to be pounding tons of fat, because that's probably going to lead to you just feeling not great during the workout. It's also potentially going to slow down the uptake of glycogen and blood sugar, and having that available for the best performance during those workouts. But that's all I want to say on that point. So now we're going to come on to how long to gain for. So I'm going to try and not make this podcast 2 hours long and try and go through these points a little bit more quickly. So the way I look at it is I want someone to gain for as long as possible whilst achieving these 3 things. So one is not spending excessive time just at maintenance. I think we're all about trying to maximize our time, and being in a slight surplus is better for growth than being at maintenance. And so you want to gain for as long as possible whilst not just being at maintenance for ages. Then 2, not getting so far away from your goal body composition. So you don't want to like become a sumo, right? Most of us want like a semblance of abs, or if we're going to be competing in any sort of proximity, we don't want to get like much over 20% of our stage weight. That's suddenly going to really increase timescales needed to get down and lean enough. So you don't want to get too far away from your goal composition. And then 3, being your most productive in the gym. And the reason I say that is, at least in my experience, and there's some people experience this, not everyone does, and some people only realize it in hindsight, that we tend to have like a body composition we feel our best at. And that is likely a range, and it might be for some people, around a 15-pound range. So for me, when I think about where I feel my best, anywhere from like 100, like high 170s to like low 190s. So around it 180 to 195 pounds. If I'm in that range, I generally am feeling really good, productive. But if I start pushing below or above that, it's not great. So I've tried to push over 200 pounds, and I'm force feeding. I'm feeling often quite sick, nauseous. I feel like just not great in the gym. My sleep is also impacted. I might even have some gastric reflux. And so that's not a great place to be, because coming back to how important training is the match that lights the fire for muscle gain. We have to make sure our training is prioritized. And so anything that takes away from that, which it could be just being so over like your upper intervention point, we don't want to be doing that. So you want your general well-being to be in a good spot. Force feeding like heavily after making many changes, of course. Like I look at my diet now when I was like getting towards 200 pounds. It wasn't great. I was having like a smoothie for breakfast. Like it was basically all liquids. So having smoothies, orange juices, weight gainers, chocolate milk, like soups to just like blend up veggies and get those in, olive oil. And yeah, just my digestion was off. I was like, yeah, going to the loo a lot and lots of liquid just coming out. So yeah, sorry for too much information there. But so those are the three things. So gain as long as you can whilst not spending excessive time at maintenance or gaining too slowly, and not getting too far away from your goal composition, and be realistic with that, right? Whilst being your most productive in the gym. So as a general rule of thumb, I like a 4-to-1 ratio, at least, to be held by. I think that's a really good place to be. Now, not everyone's always going to be able to be there because, hey, if you've come from not like me, where I was like very skinny, and you've come from a very overweight position, but over the long term, once you've gone through like losing some of that, you want to get to a position where you're a healthy body composition, you feel really good, you can go through these kind of 4-to-1. And in many ways, that's because if many of us are trying to gain about 1% per month, the fastest we really look to lose per week, is about 1%. So like we can almost lose body fat 4 times faster than we can look to gain any sort of muscle gain. So I think that ratio just works very nicely for people. But in general, I prefer people to go longer and slower than shorter and faster. Absolutely. I think if I was to give like a minimum time to be in a surplus outside of specific contexts, it might be like 3-4 months. If you can't spend at least 3-4 months in a surplus, I'm kind of like, unless there's a specific context, like you're between diets or something or what have you, I'm kind of like scratching my head to, we should really try and like maybe lose a bit more body fat first or what have you. Now we're going into some common issues and more of my experience and more of the practical stuff after going through lots of that. But I think there was lots of practical experience-based stuff, lots of things you will have heard, but maybe not described in the way that I have described them there, and just giving my personal experience and personal anecdote to them as well, and hopefully helpful. So now we're going over common issues. So one of them is gaining too fast. This is probably the most common issue that I find. And this is where on Instagram, like I said on my story, someone asked about like, how do I not gain too fast? And it's something that I have tons of experience with, and I see it with clients regularly, where they are like a horse with blinkers on during their diets, and they are super adherent. They absolutely nail their diet, their calorie deficit. They're actually more adherent to that calorie deficit than they are during their surplus. When they go into a surplus, they're less likely to adhere. And when I think about that, it's actually backwards, because when you're in a calorie deficit, your hunger is higher, and so your kind of drive to not adhere is greater. Whereas when you're in a gaining phase, like you're well fed, you shouldn't really be too hungry. And certainly, I mean, hunger is driven by multiple factors, but your hunger shouldn't be as high as what it was when you were dieting. So the drive to overeat is less, but somehow less adherent. And so it's kind of backwards in that sense. So yeah, there's so many things that go into it. I think one of them is just a case of getting a bit complacent. So I think when we're at a diet phase, we get our diet foods, we're kind of quite strict with that. We're very good about being like, hey, I need to cross my T's, dot my I's with sleep, with like nutrient quality, with all of these factors, because if I don't, I know my training's going to suffer, I'm going to lose muscle mass, and I'm not going to lose at the pace that I want to. And you get really quick payback. I think there's an easy buy-in that way. Whereas when you're gaining, as a natural, gaining muscle is like watching paint dry. You can't check photos every week or every other week and expect to see like obvious improvements to your physique, whereas you can during a diet phase. So it's very easy to just get tempted to get a bit complacent. You're maybe not as good about your kind of nutrient quality. That 80% starts scaling to 70, 60%. You have more palatable foods, lower fiber, suddenly way easier to overeat and overdo it. I also think sometimes people are overly restrictive during their diets, and it leads to a bit of a rebound during their gaining phases. It's like I think it's called like social jet lag with sleep, where during the day, or like during the day, yeah, you're not getting that kind of me time, and so you end up taking it at night, and so you don't get sufficient sleep, and it's like actually that's taking away from your sleep. You're not feeling your best, and so that's not a great way to be. I don't know if social jet lag's the right word for that. I might be using the wrong terminology. I have a feeling I might be, but you know what I mean. You know, like you're trying to get time back. It's like if your diet's been so restrictive, you're like, oh man, like I need to eat out here, whatever. I want to have that food. I've been restricting all of it, and so it might be that one, your diet approach was too aggressive or too long or too restrictive, and you just need to be a bit more balanced during those times. But also, I think a lot of the time this becomes a biggest issue is in the initial period. And these are the times that are often really challenging. It's that transition from cutting to gaining. And I always think about it, it's like a race on a track. Like you're going in one direction at good pace, and then suddenly you're going in the opposite direction, and you can't just do a 180. You actually have a bend. You have to go round. And you have to navigate that very carefully, otherwise you'll fall off track. And so there's multiple things you can't do during this period of time. One, you can't assume your previous surplus is what would be a surplus now, or even your previous maintenance is maintenance now. You have to look at what your new maintenance is, and it's going to be lower because there's adaptations, you're smaller. And so you have to recognize that. You also recognize that when you were dieting, you didn't suddenly chop out all of the food you're eating and change everything and make everything just like diet foods. You probably slowly started increasing the amount of veg you were having. You maybe decreased the palatability a little bit. You moved from rice to oats. You moved from pasta to potato. You moved from, I don't know, chicken thigh to chicken breast, slowly exchanging these things. Similarly, on that bend, you want to make slow transitions. You don't suddenly do a 180 on the foods you're eating and make them way more calorie dense and way more palatable. To use the term hedonic staircase, you want to kind of climb your way. You want to transition through that period of time, not to go to the most hedonic foods. The most palatable foods are like peak mass when you're struggling to get anything in, and you're like, hey, yeah, a scale. When I first had Mike Israetel over and James Hoffman and Melissa Davies, I can't remember the year now, it might have been 2015 for a seminar. Mike Israetel talked about this, basically, where are you in terms of your mass or your hunger or your food focus in terms of a peanut butter scale? So peanut butter, if it's like super delicious like crack, you are like way dieted. If thinking about peanut butter makes you feel nauseous, you're like peak mass, like you've really been pushing it. When he described it, I'd never actually pushed myself to the point of being that uncomfortable with food, but I have since. And I actually don't think you really want to be at either extreme outside of like circumstances you have to be. So like when you're dieting for comp prep, yeah, you have to get down to peanut butter being like crack. When you get to peak mass, I don't think you want to hang out there too long. You don't want to butt heads with it too long because, yeah, seeing peanut butter and just feeling nauseous is not a great place to be. I think less people experience that as well, but it's something to just navigate and think about. So, sorry, Ada's behind me licking her paw, and it's really off-putting. You hopefully can't hear it, but just know that's happening in the background. So, where was I with this? Gaining too fast. Another one, so it's not just the foods you're eating in terms of at home, it's also eating out. So like I said, I think sometimes people are like, oh man, I haven't seen this person, and they want to take me out, what have you. And it's like, could you have still done those social things, but picked different foods? I always think about, hey, like I try and maintain as much normality in my life as possible as I go through a contest prep. One of those things that me and my partner do is having a takeaway on Fridays. And so initially that stayed the same. Like we got the usual takeaways, there were no restrictions. I pick one week, she picks the other week. As we got deeper and deeper into the diet, I had to start placing restrictions on it. I had to be like, right, I'm only comfortable, so some of the places were like, my go-tos for dieting were Wagamama and McDonald's, because I know what I'm getting, it's standardized, and I can make it work. There got to a point where I was like, I can't even do those. It's just not worth it to me on the amount of calories I'm on. Like, hey, it's going to be a few months, no takeaways. I just need to like put my head down and get on with this. And I think that's, some people would look at that and be like, why are you making your life harder by a tool having the takeaways in there? It's like, it's not actually just making my life harder. It's so that I keep normality for as long as possible, so I don't have that need post-show to like go crazy with all these things, because it hasn't been that long that I haven't had such a thing. And I think if you're having some extreme, like you're leading to a rebound. When you're that restrictive, you lead to a rebound. And most of you listening, you should never need to get to that point unless you're dieting for contest, where you have to be that restrictive. And I think it's just important to continue to kind of be social, do these things. Now, one of the things with eating out is chefs do not care about anything but creating a tastier meal for you. And fat is flavor, they say. So they will add plenty of fats to meals to make them more palatable. You think you're getting a steak and chips, but that steak, you can't just track it as 250 grams of fillet steak. How much butter have they used to cook it? And there's all these sauces and seasonings and so on and so forth that you just might, like, those chips could be triple cooked, whatever, you know. They'll probably say they are if they are, but you know, they're very palatable. It's very easy to overeat, and so it just can quickly become a problem, especially if you aren't good at overestimating or good at estimating, or you're doing free meals or quote unquote cheat meals. These can quickly get out of hand. And so, yeah, just recognize that you might have to be, especially in that transition period, a bit selective about where you eat out and what you're personally eating. And that when you do eat out, you might have to compensate, or you might choose not to. It depends on your relationship with food and your goals and everything like that. But it's also, when you're eating out, you might just be like, right, I'm just having a main. I'm not going to have a starter, main, dessert. Or maybe a main and share a dessert, and then I'm like, this is replacing 2 of my meals during the day, what have you. But nothing comes for free. This is always something that I come about, is people will often refer to like their birthdays, Christmas, like calories don't count on those days. And I know where they're coming from. They're just saying like YOLO, enjoy, so on. But there's a real consequence to that. And it's so easy to go crazy excessive. And in the short term, that might feel really rewarding, and it might feel really good to like stuff yourself and eat such delicious foods, but probably the days after, you're going to feel really bad about that. And that could quite quickly lead to a poor relationship with food. So you kind of have to really know yourself, pick and choose your battles a little bit, and just respect that like eating out is an easy way to overdo it. And you probably want to overestimate. You probably don't want to eat out too often, and nothing comes for free. You're going to have to either pay via calories or expenditure on following or days leading in, or via more body fat accrual. What is the right solution to you? It looks different for every single context. And as you're hearing here, most of my clients are pretty serious, and so they're trying to work these sort of meals into their plan and not take away from things. But there might be occasions where it's just not possible, or it's not even warranted or worth it. Like, hey, post-show, someone might have gained at a faster pace than what we would have ideally wanted to on paper. But if they're still feeling stressed, still high levels of diet fatigue, we're not suddenly going to be like, no, we must restrict now. It's like, okay, let's not try and make this worse. We stepped off the path, we hit a bump. Let's just get back on the path, not try and make up for that lost time, and just learn from that so we can take it moving forward. So there's that. Impatience is one of them too. Like I said before, when you're cutting, it's all too easy to like see results on a week-to-week basis, scale, sometimes on a daily basis. People still get impatient on cuts, but we wanted results yesterday. During a gaining phase, when you are trying to gain real slow, it's very easy to just be like, I haven't gained weight this week, I'm going to bump my calories up. But that can quickly lead to an excessive of a surplus, especially if you make like 100, 200 calorie bumps or 10% bumps. That can quickly get out of control. You might not need a bump. You might want to wait 2 weeks. So during a diet, often I'm like, hey, 1 week, if we haven't seen the rate of loss that we want to, we could figure out making an adjustment. Maybe not, but maybe. But massing, I would never make an adjustment after 1 week of maintenance or 1 week of not going in the direction I want it to. I'd always like to wait 2 weeks. because things are slow. And just like you sometimes see whooshes and you have this like delayed fat loss effect, I think Lyle McDonald coined that. And you can sometimes have this like delayed growth spurt almost in an off season. I see this like a delayed muscle growth effect, I guess you could call it. And you probably experienced it personally, where it's like, hey, I'd been like my weight kind of maintained for a few weeks, then suddenly I gained like 2 pounds. It's like, so in the long run, you're actually gaining at the rate you wanted to. I think it's important to be patient, and really, you can't force feed muscle growth, so don't try to. Then another one is similar to like transitioning all of your food to being like mass food, and like getting rid of all your kind of wholesome, minimally processed foods, is dropping all your activity from a cut. You can't suddenly go, right, I was only losing it 1 pound a week, and so that means I can have 500 calories more, but your steps, you were at 15,000 and now you're at 10, and you're doing, I don't know, 40 minutes of cardio every other day, and now you drop that to 20. You have to recognize you're manipulating energy balance on multiple ends, not just intake, but also output. So you have to transition that too. So do be careful to do that. So I think I talked around that point quite well. Hopefully there was some useful things. I think if I had a co-host or someone to talk to, we could probably talk about that point for a long time, gaining too fast. But I think it is a case of, one, not transitioning well out of a diet. And that could be down to food selection. That could be down to not understanding energy balance and the changes of inputs and outputs, and the role of metabolic adaptation and being a smaller individual and accounting for that. It could also be 3, in terms of like eating out and inappropriate kind of food selection and not overestimating, and part of that being overly restrictive during the diet, whether or not you dieted too long or too hard, or were overly restrictive when you didn't need to be. So it's taking into account all of that. Being impatient, big one. Being complacent, big one, where you just lose sight of it. And you have to really focus on, right, food is just like something that happens in the background. Training is now the focus. Whereas when you're dieting, training is still the focus, but food is a big focus too, because you're like, I have to try and actually like eat less. And you also want to make sure that you are in control of your food during a gaining phase, where it's because you don't want to get into a situation where you're just like, oh yeah, I'm in a surplus, so like I want to gain weight, so more gaining of weight is a good thing. It's like, no, like, yeah, the goal is to gain weight, but there's like a real precedence on only gaining at a certain rate. It's not like any amount of weight gain is good. Actually, gaining over like the upper end of where you're trying to target is worse than gaining under the target aim, if that makes sense. I actually prefer someone to be at maintenance probably for a short period of time than gaining at an excessive pace for a short period of time. Because like I said, you can gain muscle at maintenance, but whilst you will be gaining muscle in an excess of a surplus, you'll also gain exponential fat. If you're at maintenance for a bit longer than we wanted, you can just gain for longer. But if you are at an excessive of a surplus for longer, you are going to have to diet for longer. And as I mentioned before, maintenance is you're more likely to grow muscle than you are during a deficit. And so we're putting more cards in our favor if we're nearing maintenance versus excessive of a surplus. Hopefully that's clear and makes sense. So the next one is gaining too slow. So I do see this being an issue, but it's happens less often, I would say, where people just get a bit too attached to being lean and they lose sight of their goal and the long-term goal. And sometimes they can be overly restrictive. So like I said, there's kind of a sweet spot, and a great analogy for this is a dimmer switch on like a light. You're never like fully bright, but you're never off. You're always on, but to more or less amounts. And so during a diet, you are more on. And as you go into maintenance, surplus, like you're less on necessarily of being like rigid and restrictive. You can be a bit more free and flexible. I think that's a good thing, still with constraints and bumpers in place. And so I think the person here, when they're gaining too slow, they're too far on that restrictive end. As I mentioned before, and I said I'd come back to this point, with Eric Helm's study on different surplus sizes, the group that were trying to target a 5% surplus couldn't really do it. It was just too small of a surplus for them to like know whether or not they were achieving it. And so I think there's just that practical part of being in a surplus and allowing yourself to maybe gain a bit faster. And I'd say a little bit, because I'm going to sound contradictory here, but maybe a bit faster than you need to theoretically, but so you can practically track it. Because you, like I said, I would prefer someone to be nearer maintenance than excessive of a surplus, but you don't want to be at maintenance for literally months upon months upon months because you're scared about being in too excessive of a surplus. You need to eventually venture out there a little bit and accept it. And there might be times of which you do gain a slightly excessive pace, and that's okay. You learn from those times, and in the long run, you'll probably sort it out. But certainly I've been there where I've been very obsessive about on a week-to-week basis, trying to gain at a very particular rate of gain and making modifications to my diet very frequently. And really, I've just kind of gone up, down, up, down, up, down. And actually, I've spent probably plenty of time in a deficit, some time in a surplus, and then mostly just maintenance. And really, I was so focused on my diet. It was such a stress that I didn't focus enough on my training. And like I said, training, the match that lights the fire for muscle gain has to be the focus, and the diet's just on the back end. So I don't want people to get over focused. And honestly, once you're through that bend, that transition period into a mass, and your body is happy in this kind of band of body weight that's like its sweet spot body composition wise, where you can train really well, a surplus is just going to carry you through. You adapt much faster to a calorie deficit because the body's trying to protect against like death and starvation. And it adapts harder the longer you diet, the harder you diet. But a gaining phase, everyone's a little bit different. But if you're gaining, and you have been for the last month, really nicely on a certain intake, it's probably going to last you a long time. It's not like you need to make many adjustments. Initially, like I said, out of the bend, once your metabolism starts ramping up a little bit because of those adaptations that take place towards like your NEAT and NEPA and that sort of thing, then it should be fairly steady. So you might put yourself in what you think is like a surplus, then actually it becomes maintenance, and then you need to bump it above that. But then you get like weeks, month into gaining, and it probably is pretty steady there, and you'll just gain for ages. So bear that in mind, and you don't need to make frequent adjustments. Like I said, at most like 2 weeks, but you might want to wait longer than that, depending on the rate of gain you're targeting, of course, is a little bit different. But yeah, like I said, if you're trying to target too slow of a rate of gain and like you're attached to leanness, that can really start biting you in the arse. So I had the double whammy of being a bit too lean, where I was maybe slightly under my lower intervention point of where I start to feel good, and trying to gain really slow. And so I just like, my training was not the best, and I really didn't grow as much muscle as I should have. So yeah, losing sight of the goal of, no, we are actually trying to be in a surplus, we are trying to gain weight, and we have to accept fat accrual. And there might be times of which my rate of gain goes a bit above where I'd expect it to be, but in the long run, it should land where I want it to be. And not trying to focus on gaining the like rate limiting amount of muscle I could potentially gain, but gaining a reasonable and practical amount of body weight over time. So much less than 1% per month is pretty damn hard to track. And there's not that many situations I think that's what I would target. Like less than 1%, that is. Most of the time, 1% is a good, like, hedge your bets. Like, that's about as slow as you can practically probably track well. But focusing on performance is really important. And the more over fat you are, the more fat stores you have on your body, the more energy stores you have available that can help build muscle too. So again, that influences, like that actually, again, on muscle building potential, the more fat stores you have available in your body, that actually enhances your muscle growth potential. Whereas the leaner you are, not so much. Anyway, regardless, you don't want to be so over fat as well, by the way, that suddenly your hormones and insulin sensitivity and all of that is like really in a poor place. So don't take me wrong, within a range that's acceptable. Anyway, so going too slow, going too fast, covered those. Gaining too long, so easy, just getting over fat. I think some people just permabulk, right? Just gain for way too long. And I've seen it where there'll be naturals who have to diet off 40, 50 pounds to get down to stage, or even that amount just to get to see their abs. And I'm like, man, you might have gained muscle going up there, and you might have been your most muscular up there, but you're going to have lost quite a bit of it coming down. Like sumo wrestlers are individuals who have the most fat-free mass on on them. But if you got them down to stage ready condition, how much of that have they now lost? And are you better off just maintaining a slightly leaner physique that's more towards your goals? I think you probably are. Gaining too short, so it's, as I said before, 3 or 4 months. I don't think it's worth really doing much less than that. You get really good momentum during gaining phases. You probably noticed it during your kind of training mesocycles. Like you just get this good momentum going. So I think that's important. And I think people lose motivation. It comes back to that kind of complacency, that trying to force feed muscle gain, and the potential just get a bit bored during their gaining phases. And I think that's where like training motivation comes in, and keeping training interesting and fun. I think a lot of people like to poo-poo that, like, no, training should just be optimal and I'll do whatever's best. Who cares about preferences? But I actually think it's a silly way to go about things, especially as a coach. I dial into my clients' preferences and what makes them tick often. Yeah, there's a lot of boring basic things that you have to do, especially as someone who's trying to be competitive. Like, hey, I don't love training my calves, my abs. They're not fun, but I got to get it done because I want them to grow. I want to be my best on stage. And you might have some muscle groups like that yourself. But hey, if you love leg pressing, but hey, everyone's saying you should be doing hack squats and back squats, leg press can be a great movement for you. You know, so you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into certain things or ways of doing things. There's so many roads to Rome. Another phrase that I like to say often on the podcast. But yeah, losing that motivation can happen. And so I do think there's ways around that. Again, training, I talk about that because that's a big piece for you, and focusing on the things and the positives of the gaining phase in for itself, like the extra energy you have for other things in life, the extra food freedom you have. That's something that I think can be great, is like, hey, trying different foods from different cultures and experiencing that can be really nice. And again, you got to fall in love with your training in the process. And again, if there's anything that you're doing where it's like, do I have to be doing that, or could I slightly manipulate it to be more closer towards my preference? And if you can make it closer towards your preference and something you enjoy, I would do it. And that might mean switching things up now and then. You might just do it just for the sake of like, hey, this exercise or this program isn't stale from like a muscle physiology perspective, but my psychology it is. So, hey, let's move from and I've done this with clients, like a push-pull leg split. Let's go to an upper lower, just for a bit of difference. Or like, hey, maybe you're getting bored of your food. Let's like rotate in some recipes and stuff. Let's keep it a bit exciting, you know? Or you might just at some point decide, hey, let's just chuck in like a 3-week mini cut just to kind of, for lack of a better term, mini cuts in many ways are thought of as helping your mass gaining phase because they're buying you more massing time, because they're undoing the kind of quote unquote, I guess, dirt you've built up, the body fat you've built up, so you can start from like a cleaner base and gain for longer. But also they are reinstating a lot of habits that maybe get lost. So I think they potentiate mass gaining phases for that reason too, because they get you to like dial in your diet, dial in your sleep, dial in your training. And again, you can clean things up a little bit and see what's happened underneath and get a bit of like, ooh, that's exciting. Look how much I've gained here. Let's get back into massing. My hunger's up and all of that. And your motivation might just rise as well. I think, again, a lot of people look at textbook and like, what should I be doing on paper? But sometimes in practice, you have to take the person into consideration and what's driving them. And it's easy to get complacent in long gaining phases. So having a bit of pulsatility in this variation that might not be necessary on paper, but in practice, it becomes useful to see the best progress possible. So gaining too short, gaining too long, gaining too slow, gaining too fast. They're some of the most common issues, and they're some of the ways that I troubleshoot and think about them. The last one is making adjustments. So this has actually been talked about a little bit throughout this whole presentation in terms of, hey, you don't want to make adjustments too often. You're looking for like a slow rate of gain, these sort of things. But I'm just going to give you some things that I think about when making adjustments. So first of all is obviously those daily weigh-ins under similar conditions, taking a weekly average, comparing to the last week, but then looking at the last 2 weeks, how's that trend gone? And then even looking past that at historical data, how's the last month gone? So looking real long-term, zooming out, and you could even look at times of which you've been at similar body weights with similar expenditure, like a year ago in the mass, where was my food? And that can give you data and helpful, like the more experience you get, the less anxiety you get surrounding these, and the more confidence you have that, hey, like I just know my body responds well to this amount of calories, and like you normally land around the same places. So historic data, averages, trends over time, looking more long term, especially when you're trying to gain at slower rates, you need to zoom out further. I know I've seen it on many occasions with clients where they can like lose weight one week and then regain and gain weight the next week. I average out the two and they're bang on the rate of gain that we want. If you looked at one of those weeks, you might like, hey, we got to bump up food, and then they suddenly gain like 2 pounds. You're like, oh no, I need to bring down food, and they suddenly lose. It's like, man, yeah, I think you're just pissing away time and creating stress, making too frequent adjustments. Like I said, once the body is in like a pretty happy place after you've gone through that transitional period, you can gain on the same food for a long time. It's really, your body adapts harder when it gets below your lower end intervention point and above your upper intervention point. And so you'll notice when you're like post show, you don't need that much food to gain at quite an exponential pace initially, but then your body will really ramp up. And it's similar to when you're getting near your upper intervention point. Oh, sorry, it doesn't ramp up as fast. That's what I'm trying to say. You'll find like you'll be gaining a pound, and you'll just keep gaining that pound really easily and happily until you're nearer to that body weight where you settle and you're a bit more comfortable. But when you get to the upper end, so that's like me, it's like post show, I've got like a magnet drawing me really strongly to 180 pounds. And I can do as much as I want with my food and stuff, but my body just wants to get back there. And I'm not going to need that much additional food to do that. Now, once I'm traveling from 180 to 195 pounds, suddenly when I start going from 180 to 185 pounds, probably don't need much adjustment. But then to get to 185 to 190, I might need like 100, 200 calorie bump. But then to get to 190 to 195, I might need like a 400 calorie bump. And then once I get like to 200 pounds, I'm needing like an extra 500 calories. It's just because the body gets so efficient at wasting away energy and adapting harder once it's nearer these intervention points. So once you're in that sweet spot, that window of where you want to hang out, that's when you don't need to make many adjustments. You want to be pretty slow about making any. And especially as you're nearer to the lower end, like the leaner you are, the less adjustments you're going to need as well. The good news is also, as you get fatter, obviously that fat can be used as fuel to support things. So even if you are a bit slow about your adjustments then, and you're a bit closer to maintenance or the slower end of the rate of gain you want, you have that extra fuel stored. So even if you're a bit slow, it's not such a big deal, you know? So I think that just really, really furthers the point of making subtle, small adjustments infrequently, basing off long-term historical data. One other thing is bad data. So because you're in a gaining phase, you're going to be eating out probably more. And that means there's more likely to be bad data. And what I mean is if 6 days out of the week, you almost follow somewhat of a meal plan, and then on one day of the week, you would go and eat out. I know this for me, if I go and have ramen, Wagamama type of meal or a high sodium meal, the next day the weight can be like all over the shop. It's just recognizing that data might not be something you want to take into consideration. So you might star it and take it out of your weekly average. You might not weigh in. Another example would be, this is a strange example, but it really gives it, kind of makes it very obvious. When I go and get a tattoo, I get tons of inflammation. So I'm holding like a couple of pounds of fluid, like my calves like double in size when I get my calves tattooed. And so I just don't weigh in because I'm like, why would I weigh that? Like, that's not useful data. It's just going to be completely strange. Or if you go and have a wedding, or if you're weighing in at completely random times, you're like, oh, I couldn't weigh in until I got home from the gym. It's like, well, now you've drank a load of fluids, you've had a meal in you, like that's bad data. You want the data you use to be useful kind of data that is representative of how things generally go. What I will say is you do want to be, even if you do star out kind of weigh-ins after meals, you'll see the trend of your body weight come through the rest of the week anyway, once your sodium and water retention from that kind of settles. So recognize bad data. And just reinforcing the final thing is long-term trends over time. That's really kind of when making adjustments. And like I said, small adjustments. And especially when you're trying to gain at slower rates, like you don't want to just jump up 10% of your calories. Like that would be wild to me. Like if someone's maintained for 2 weeks and then bumping up their calories by 300 because now you've assumed they're at maintenance. Sometimes all they need is a 50, 100 calorie nudge. Less than that, I'm really skeptical about, because like we can't even be sure that your degree of accuracy is there, because food labels are allowed like up to, I think, a 20%. I think the FDA allow like a 20% error margin. So that's part of it. If you eat quite a bit of packaged food, I don't know if any of you have ever weighed out like, hey, I noticed recently some protein bars I've been having, I just weighed one out. I was like, man, they give me 5-10 grams extra every bar. Like suddenly there's almost 20% additional calories on this bar, which is like 40 calories every time I'm eating it. It's like, oh, so if you're eating more of those packaged foods, suddenly your accuracy really dips. You can't be that accurate with your expenditure anyway. Some days you might be doing more or less steps. Some days you might be training legs versus arms or upper body. And so there's no need to be that precise. That's why ranges are really important, and taking longer, because we're trying to gain at a slower rate and we're trying to view a smaller change. You need to zoom out and just accept that there might be times of which there's a bit of maintenance there. There might be times of gaining a bit too fast, but look at the long-term trends and how they're going. It's kind of similar to when you're at the end of contest prep and you're trying to measure body weight and see like how much weight you're losing, but you might only be trying to lose grams of fat tissue because you're so lean already, you can't afford to lose faster than that. But there could be therefore larger variations in water weight. So actually the scale is better off picking up water weight changes than it is actual fat tissue changes. So the scale becomes less and less useful of a tool, especially on a kind of short-term basis, and you're better off looking at physique shots, stuff like this. That comes to something I should talk about at least for a bit of time in terms of making adjustments, is not just considering body weight. I've talked about body weight a lot here, rates of gain, but I also would consider other things. Like I said, well-being is one of them. So you want to make sure someone is feeling good, able to perform well in the gym, sleep is good. But in terms of like tracking and monitoring progress, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot and like gain excessively fast or slow based off some assumptions of someone's gaining potential, because one thing that we can't know is someone's genetic capacity to build muscle. And so you might assume a certain amount based off the information you've got, and it might need to change. And so the only time that's really a problem if they start gaining exponential fat that you didn't want. Because if someone gains a bit slower, I'm always like, hey, you can just gain for longer. It's not such a big deal. But this is where monitoring photos comes in. So you can do that. Standardized photos under similar conditions. And that means similar conditions in terms of lighting and pump, no pump, flexing, not flexing, and like in the morning or after a workout, whatever, try and keep them as close as you can. And then only getting those every month or so is wise, because we just don't expect to see huge changes. So photos can help. And then training performance in the gym, if that's not going up and someone's in a surplus, I'm kind of getting concerned as to why it's not going up. Do they need to do more, do less, kind of pay attention to their fatigue management, their volume tolerance, that sort of thing. So you're using performance, visuals, using body weight scale. The other one that I like to use that's quite simple is just like a circumference measurements. So you could use waist measurements, can be quite helpful, especially when you might expect someone seeing body recomposition or you're aiming for that. I'm kind of talking about a surplus, so it's less of a big deal. But the ones I really rely on heavily is gym performance, scale weight, visuals. They're the ones I think that are really easy to use too and can be very informative. Just realizing kind of what you're expecting to see in them. I don't have a client who's been training 10 years and check in after a month of gaining where they've gained a kilo and see their photos and expect me to be able to pick out like, oh yeah, you've gained muscle here, here, here. It's like, no. It's just like, we're kind of just checking that you're not gaining fat too fast via those visuals and that you're still holding condition well. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. I know I've thrown a lot of stuff into this. It's a big, big topic. You could probably dive into many of the areas that I've spoken about and dive into them and have a huge deep dive and discussion. But I thought this might be useful if, this is a bodybuilding podcast. Bodybuilding is about kind of trying to grow as much as possible. And I don't know when I last did a big kind of deep dive or covered the topics in such detail as I have today. So hopefully that's been useful. I'd love your feedback. I'd love it in terms of if you hated a solo episode or if you loved it. If there's any particular points you want me to dig deeper into, I can always do a follow-up, like covering off various questions based off this. Or if you'd like a deep dive on a different topic, cutting, whatever it might be, kind of the practical side of that in particular, training ones or more nutrition ones, I'm open to it all. As I've said before, I'm not going to get into the habit of doing even one of these a month, but there might be a few thrown in now and then when I have the time for it, when I have a subject I feel well educated and able to speak on to a high level, and that you guys are really interested in. That's probably the most important thing. So yeah, that's the episode. As always, guys, if you've listened this long and you're not subscribed, please do subscribe, whether or not that's on YouTube or over on Spotify or whatever podcast platform. Subscriptions are really, really helpful. Do share this with anyone else you think might find it valuable. If you're on YouTube, give me a comment, give me a thumbs up. Really appreciate that. Give me your feedback, like really, truly, even if it's just like, enjoyed this, Steve. Any comment is super helpful. Like I appreciate each and every single one of you. Even if you can leave a thumbs up, again, you don't want to comment, totally happy with that. And then on Spotify, you can actually leave a rating. So you can give us a 5 out of 5 star rating. That would be really helpful. And of course, I'd be remiss not to let you know that at Revive Stronger, and I've mentioned it many times in this episode, we are an online coaching company. That's what I spend the majority of my time doing, is sitting here reviewing spreadsheets, reviewing video diaries from my clients, reviewing technique videos, posing, all that good stuff, data, to help them get to their best physique goals and to help them with everything from physiology, psychology, and getting the best and most out of them, also educating them at the same time. I always want to be that coach that isn't just kind of giving you direction, but is also give you the whys behind things, so you can take that and apply it. Many of our clients are coaches, majority are in fact, so you can apply it to your clients or take it for you long term, so you feel educated on leaving, not like, hey, I've left Steve and the only way I can get results is if I'm with Steve. So no, you've got the tools at your disposal now, and so you can go on your merry way after having had our time together. So if you are interested in very personalized one-on-one coaching with Revive Stronger, we've got myself, Mike Chalice, who you might have seen is on the improvement season regularly, and we've got Ryan Solomon as well, who's a bit more in the background. If you'd like coaching with any one of us, you can apply in there's a link in the description where you can click through, and then you can read more about our coaching, what it involves, and you can apply for a consultation. But I'll leave that there. Guys, thank you so much. This has been great to talk through. Like I said, hopefully helpful. And I guess I'll catch you in the next episode. Cheers.